Yay! Today is the 45th anniversary of Mount St. Helens volcanic eruption! So today is May 18th, 1980, except that it's probably not May 18th anymore because I am slow at posting things. But either way, I'm gonna tell you guys about Mount St. Helens eruption as a whole and also the precursor or warning signs that Mount St. Helens showed before her main phase eruption. All of my information comes from the USGS, which is the United States Geologic Survey, and first-hand accounts from some of the geologists that I have met in the past. I also used the USGS Volcanoes Twitter to get a lot of these photos, and they also did a really cool recap leading up to the May 18th eruption, posting pretty much every day on their Twitter, which you guys can go look if you're interested in. Oh wait, first things first. What is a Mount St. Helens? So, Mount St. Helens is shown here behind me. Both of these images are Mount St. Helens. The left side, this is Mount St. Helens pre-eruption. So Mount St. Helens was a beautiful conical or cone-shaped volcano before it had its eruption. It was also known as Mount Fuji of the West because it had this beautiful snow-capped peak to it and similar shape to Mount Fuji. That is not the case anymore. As you can see on my right, this is Mount St. Helens soon after the main phase eruption. So you can see that cone shape has now been reduced to kind of a melted puddle of ice cream. So now you might be wondering where Mount St. Helens is located. She's located in the United States and Washington State. So this is North America, this is the United States, Washington State's part of the Pacific Northwest. She's right here in this little red triangle shape. She's a part of a larger volcanic arc known as the Cascade Range. So there's multiple volcanoes within this range. Mount St. Helens is the one that has erupted most recently, and she's the one that we're talking about today. You might have heard of some of these other ones. If you're not from the United States, or even if you're in the United States, I'm curious if you guys recognize any of these volcanoes, or do you think that they're kind of important to know? More so if you're in the United States, probably more important. But if you're not from the United States, I'm just curious if you ever heard of this volcanic arc and the volcanoes contained within. Mount Rainier, Crater Lake, both of these are probably the most famous, only because they're national parks within the United States, so they're quite frequently visited. So I'd imagine that at least some people have heard of it, those volcanoes, and also Crater Lake had a pretty massive eruption that's quite famous. Not as recent as Mount St. Helens, though, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. So one thing you guys might be noticing is that there's a whole linear line of volcanoes here. And now you're like, what is producing all of these systems to be located here, and how is it causing them to even be volatile enough to erupt like Mount St. Helens? To understand this, you need to be able to basically understand a little bit about plate tectonics. Plate tectonics in general, or in a simplistic explanation, are basically ginormous plates or puzzle pieces that wrap around our globe. So on Earth, we are standing, assuming that you're outside, you're standing on Earth's crust. Earth's crust is brittle, it's rigid, will break into these pieces, and we are all floating on a very hot mantle that moves, and that will move these plates. So we have different plates around the world. The ones that we're going to focus on that make the volcanic arc of the Cascades is going to be Juan de Fuca and the North American plate. So this is the Juan de Fuca plate right here. The Juan de Fuca plate is actually subducting or going underneath the North American plate. Here's a cross section of this, when you have the Juan de Fuca plate, if you're following my mouse, subducting underneath this continental crust where most people are living in the Pacific Northwest at least. This is thick continental crust, and this is oceanic crust, or crust that is underneath the ocean. This oceanic crust is subducting underneath this continental thicker crust. And when you bring cold, water-rich, basically sediment and rock into a very, very hot environment, such as the mantle, what's going to happen is you are going to basically allow the melting temperature to change or lower due to the hydrous minerals that you are bringing down that are then exsolving to create melt. This melt is going to be more buoyant or less dense than the surrounding mantle and rock, and so it is going to be buoyant and float or rise up to the crust, where it then can stay in storage and then occasionally actually erupt in violent eruptions such as the Mount St. Helens eruption. Above my head is basically an image of what is underneath Mount St. Helens. So this was done through the IMUSH project. So what this means is this VP is referring to the velocity of P waves. You don't really need to know the details of this, but P waves are just a wave that comes out of earthquakes. It's the first or primary wave that comes out of earthquakes. We can use P waves and other types of seismic waves or earthquake waves to basically image what's underneath the crust. And so underneath Mount St. Helens, using the color coding, you can see that this orangish yellowish color is where you basically have your velocities being slower, which is indicating that you most likely have some type of magma or mushy or liquidy type magma system here. So this is what you can consider the storage system of the magma that can be erupted by Mount St. Helens in the future at some point, because this is after 1980s eruption, this study here. So this is the shallow magma storage zone. This is going to be mostly the magma that Mount St. Helens is tapping into for future eruptions, but it can be recharged by lower magma systems. This is still an ongoing new kind of research area. We're using what's known as seismic tomography to basically image magma chambers, not only at Mount St. Helens, but around the world at different active volcanoes, and trying to understand these volcanic systems. But this is just showing you that Mount St. Helens still has magma and is most likely going to erupt again. Not anytime soon, but Mount St. Helens, she's kind of like the grumpiest of all the volcanoes. Her activity in comparison to the other volcanoes in the Cascade range is a lot higher. She's erupts quite frequently. If a volcano was going to erupt in the next 50 years, my money would probably go on Mount St. Helens erupting again, especially since she did have eruptions in the mid-2000s, which was just lava dome eruptions, but that's still a volcanic eruption, not to the scale of the 1980 though. Okay, so let's get into the timeline. We travel back in time and it is now March 16th. On March 16th, we have 100 earthquakes within a week. Maybe that's weird, maybe it's not. In this case, for Mount St. Helens, it was quite weird. Mount St. Helens had a background rate of maybe 1 to 2 dozen earthquakes per month. So 100 earthquakes within a week is a lot higher earthquake activity or seismic activity than what had been previously seen. These earthquakes are not like the I'm gonna knock your house down and the walls are gonna shake and your pictures are gonna fall type earthquakes. These are pretty low magnitude earthquakes, so it's nothing that is going to be catastrophic, but it is something that is noticeable on seismometers and things that you think about as abnormal. So March 16th is thought to be basically the pinpoint start of the initiation of Mount St. Helens waking up. March 24th, though, we have 20 earthquakes within an hour. So basically a whole month of earthquakes happening within an hour. So that's a lot more activity. So you can see with the red line, the earthquake activity per day was increasing. Up here, you can see different earthquakes outside of the ones in the graph below, but these are basically just showing you where the earthquakes are located on the edifice of Mount St. Helens, so the top-down image, and then also where they're located at depth. And you can see these two different earthquake swarms in different times, which are listed up here, are really overlapping and they're in the same area, indicating that this is where the majority of the activity is in Mount St. Helens, and also probably where the 1980 activity of earthquakes was as well. Okay, let's move on. We are now entering May 27th, 1980. So this is the first eruption that happens at Mount St. Helens. So this is no longer earthquakes. I mean, earthquakes are still happening, but this is bigger than earthquakes. We are now having volcanic eruptions. So we're having what we call steam eruptions or phoritic eruptions. They're not actually magma eruptions. So no lava is being erupted at these types of eruptions. This is going to be mostly gas and steam. Still can break through the rock and make a lot of dust and ash rain down, but the majority of it is just steam. You can see here there's a steam cloud or plume coming from one of the eruptions. This steam eruption in the beginning created a 200-foot crater and also these massive cracks in the glacier. So this is a glacier that sits on top of Mount St. Helens, or used to sit on top. When this eruption happened, evacuation orders were given for the area of Mount St. Helens, and the state of Washington entered what is known as a state of emergency. So basically, like, everyone's eyes are on Mount St. Helens, and we're going to now send geologists to now monitor the volcano to understand what is happening. March 30th, 1980, we now have the development of our first geology station, Coldwater 1. This is Coldwater 1. This is Mount St. Helens in the background. Now that we're having these ferritic or steam eruptions happening, we are now heavily monitoring the volcano to understand what's going to happen and hopefully warn and evacuate people if a main phase eruption is going to happen, or an eruption with magma is going to happen. So here you can see the crater, and you also can see the cracks within the glacier as well. On March 30th, we had 93 earthquakes. I don't know, I said earthquakes. We had 93 eruptions in one day. Again, these are steam eruptions, not magmatic, but still, that's a lot of eruptions. So Mount St. Helens is awake and she is restless. We actually will have, due to all of these eruptions on March 30th, we're now going to have 2 craters form on the top of Mount St. Helens. So it's not just that one crater through the glacier, we now have 2. April 1st, 1980, so a few days later, the eruptions now start to grow larger, and still again, steam eruptions, but every time these eruptions are happening, they are breaking through the rock and ash that's already on the volcano from previous eruptions. So you are getting more and more volcanic debris within these steam eruptions, even though the steam eruption isn't erupting its own new volcanic material. So here's one of the darker clouds from the steam eruption, and this larger eruption and the several that followed after allowed the 2 craters on the volcanic edifice of Mount St. Helens to actually merge and create a larger volcanic system. These eruptions did also change in chemistry slightly. So now sulfuric gas, or sulfur-rich gas, is now being detected in large amounts from these steam eruptions. So volcanic gas changes are now happening within the volcanic system. Okay, a few days later, April 3rd, we now have a larger volcanic crater. So this is a plane flying above Mount St. Helens. So you can kind of see the scale of the crater here. This crater is about 1,500 feet wide and 300 feet deep. So this is a massive crater that now exists. And this is another steam eruption happening within that crater. So we're going to start seeing more and more of these steam eruptions leading to a larger and larger crater system within the top of Mount St. Helens. A few days later, it is now April 8th, 1980. We have had constant eruptions up until April 8th. Again, not magmatic eruptions, but steam eruptions. They are going to basically not stop, but significantly slow down, and the volcano is going to be quiet. When I say quiet, I mean instead of like an eruption every hour, it's now going to be an eruption once per day. So it's still very active, but in terms of its activity from before April 8th, this is a significant slowdown of eruptions. So this is suggesting maybe she's done. Maybe she's done erupting. Or that there's something else changing and we're going towards a larger catastrophic style of eruption. And again, all these images shown here, these are all steam images or steam eruptions from Mount St. Helens that the USGS shared. Okay, April 12th, 1980, the eruptions are becoming harder to see. Again, they're only averaging about once per day, but the crater is getting so deep that it's actually a lot for the actual steam eruption to rise above, or I shouldn't say rise above, but raise out of the crater to actually be seen from the geologists and people observing the volcano. So the columns of eruptive material has to reach about 1,000 feet to even reach the outside of the crater to be then seen by any observers. So eruptions are getting harder to see. Technology in the 1980s is a little bit different, so we're not going to be able to witness it like we would today. The next day, on April 13th, the volcano was measured to have moved about a foot. I'm not saying the volcano like picked itself up and like walked a foot away, more that the volcano, at least part of the volcano, the northern side of the volcano, swelled to about a foot. So it basically grew a little lump that was measured by a foot. This is geologists actually looking at the volcano and using their measurement instrumentation to look at the deformation of the volcanic cone, but they actually thought the instrumentation was broken because the volcano shouldn't move that much in the time that they were observing it. So this is going to be, we'll revisit this in a little bit. We also had a bunch of hikers and news outlets going up to the exclusion zone or the evacuation zone on Mount St. Helens to, I don't know, I mean, I get it, to like get a better view. Like, I get it. It's a volcano erupting. This is like a once in a lifetime thing. You might risk your life to go see it. It happens. But Seattle TV, a news station, broke the rules and actually flew on the crater and landed there on the summit to film. So this obviously is not allowed, but the rules are very hard to enforce, especially back then. And it's kind of just like on the people at this point. Like, if you want to go close to an erupting volcano, you kind of know what you signed up for. This also is another issue that's happening because the volcanic eruptions are decreasing. It's causing people to get a false sense of security that they can get closer, or if they were forced to evacuate, that they can go back to their houses. So a lot of unrest is happening between the public and the geologists and the government, because people want to come back, but the government and geologists are saying it's not safe. But they're like, but it's not erupting, it's fine, it's safe. I just want to go grab like my book or something. It's not that they want to live there, they just want to go and grab their things since they were forced to evacuate suddenly. Getting towards the end of April, we have the north flank growing more and more, where it now has basically a cryptodome on it, which is a volcanic bulge. So it's basically magma is swelling underneath the area of the volcano, pushing the volcanic face, in this case, the north face of Mount St. Helens, pushing it up. And it's moving quite fast. Sometimes it was moving 5 feet per day. This is a big risk because if you have just a bulge growing on the side of a volcano, it can be impacted by gravity, become unstable, and you can have an avalanche and landslide, which can be an issue for anyone that is nearby, even outside of the exclusion zone, since those types of flows can travel down slope and reach further than what the exclusion zones are listed as currently. Since Mount St. Helens is having these steam eruptions less and less frequently, this cryptodome is growing very, very quickly. So the cryptodome is basically what all the geologists are now going to focus on, because this is something new. This is something weird that hasn't really been monitored ever in the history of volcanic study. A few days later, we have Harry Truman. I mean, Harry Truman had been around this whole entire time. Harry Truman lived up by Spirit Lake, which is one of the volcanic lakes by Mount St. Helens. It's still there. It's a very beautiful lake. But Harry Truman is in the exclusion zone and was told to evacuate. But again, you can just say no. No one's going to pull you out of your house. So Harry Truman, not the president, do not get confused with the US president, he refused to leave. So Harry Truman had the right to stay and live in his house, and that is what he decided to do. This gave him a lot of fame and notoriety. I don't know why that word was very hard to say. People would write him like love letters and send them to him and be like, oh, I love what you're doing, you should marry me, because he was single, he lived alone, kind of. He had 16 cats. I'm all for having 16 cats, but we'll get to why I'm upset that he has 16 cats. But Harry Truman gets a lot of fame and is just kind of a character. You guys can you can look him up if you want to know any more information about him. May 1st, so we're now in the month of May, we get the next geologic station. So we still have Coldwater 1, which is observing the volcano, but Coldwater 2 is the newest station that you can see here in this image. And this is basically monitoring the north flank of the volcano. So they're watching the cryptodome growth, or the bulge of the volcano grow. That's the responsibility of Coldwater 2. Both of these geologic sites, Coldwater 2 is like a trailer, as you can see, and Coldwater 1 is a bunch of tents and cars. So these aren't like crazy scientific stations that we might have today, but this is the best that we have in 1980. May 7th to May 15th, we have basically the cryptodome still developing. Not much has changed there, but we are also still getting frantic eruptions, or steam eruptions, that are happening, as you can see in the image. So pretty cool eruptions are still happening. But that bulge that has been growing on the side of Mount St. Helens does have an avalanche, an 800-foot wide part of the cryptodome that you can see in this image did shed off to create an avalanche / debris flow that was, luckily people were evacuated for, so it didn't cause any casualties. But a magnitude 5 earthquake is what triggered the bulge to collapse. So we talked about earthquakes at the beginning. Earthquakes are still happening. This is a little bit larger of an earthquake that is happening. Most of the other ones are like magnitude 1 to 3 to even lower than magnitude 1, but still, this is a fear. A large shaking event like an earthquake can dislodge parts of this cryptodome. At this point, geologists are pretty sure this cryptodome is fully generated from magma swelling up underneath of it. This is the Coldwater 2 station, the one that is monitoring the cryptodome growth and movement of, or at least on the north flank of the volcano. Harry Glinken was the geologist in charge of monitoring Coldwater 2 for a couple weeks before the main phase eruption, but he was scheduled to be transferred out because he needed his time. He's ready to go. And so Don Swanson was scheduled to replace Harry, but something came up that did not allow Don to make it to Coldwater 2, so Dave Johnson decided to take his place. Carolyn Dredger, another geologist, except she at this time was a graduate student. She was studying the glaciers. She was a glaciologist, or a glaciology student, studying the glaciers on Mount St. Helens. She was supposed to stay the night on May 17th. She had a tent and everything was ready, but Dave Johnson told her to not stay the night and to go home just because there were a lot of new earthquake and volcanic activity symptoms that the volcano was experiencing, and Dave did not think it was safe for anyone to stay. And so he decided to man Coldwater 2 himself through the night of May 17th. This image here is Dave Johnson. This is the last image of him, which was actually taken by Harry before that he left. Something that this is coming from a book regarding the interviews and lead up to several volcanic disasters that happened in the geologic past. This is coming from Don Swanson and Harry Glinken. Apparently, Dave had noticed pyroclastic deposits on the ridge where Coldwater 2 was stationed. Pyroclastic deposits mean that past volcanic eruptions have reached where Coldwater 2 was. Both Coldwater 1 and 2 were located in what was thought to be safe areas, meaning that if the volcano did erupt, they would have enough time to leave that area and be safe. This is not going to be the case. At this point, the cryptodome or bulge is about 450 feet displaced outwards from Mount St. Helens. So this is a massive bulge that has grown on the side that will trigger the main phase eruption. May 18th, 1980, the day of the main phase catastrophic Mount St. Helens eruption, Dave Johnson got up around 5 a.m. and took note of the clear skies and no active change to the volcano, and reported that around 7 a.m. to the basically the station in Vancouver, Washington. That was where everyone was placed, which is now where the current Cascade Observatory is located today. May 18th, 1980, at 8:32 a.m., there was a magnitude 5.1 earthquake. This earthquake is similar size to the earthquake that dislodged the 800-foot wide section of the bulge to collapse earlier, but now this time the bulge is a lot larger. And so this magnitude 5.1 earthquake causes a massive landslide to form on the north side of Mount St. Helens. Dave Johnson radios in to Vancouver and says, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Unfortunately, no one was manning the radio at the time, so this message was recorded and not heard live, and this is the last recording or last moment of Dave Johnson's life. This volcanic eruption was not actually filmed, but a photographer that I'm blanking on the name of snapped a bunch of photos consecutively to get the images that I'm showing here. So this is Mount St. Helens 10 seconds after the earthquake. Well, okay, I shouldn't say 10 seconds after the earthquake. The volcano didn't fully start its collapse until 25 seconds after the earthquake. So this is 10 seconds into the landslide. This is 42 seconds from the landslide. This is 52, and then this is 60 seconds. Something that you guys might notice is this just looks like a basic landslide. You're just having some land slide downhill. Here, though, you actually have two plumes that are coming out of the volcano. This is actually showing you two eruptions that are happening, one from the top of the volcano and one from the side of the volcano. So we're getting two phases of an eruption in an instant moment, basically. This image, I think, is actually showing what I'm talking about a little bit better. So you can see here, this is basically a magma system on the top of Mount St. Helens. When the landslide happens, you're releasing not only magma on the side, but you're also releasing magma from that magma chamber above. I mean, it's the same magma chamber, you're just shearing it off, but still, you are getting two eruptions. You're getting a vertical column eruption that's going straight into the atmosphere, and you're getting what's known on the other one as a lateral blast, meaning you have a blast or eruption that is being projected to the side of the volcano, which is something that has never been seen and was never confirmed to be known at this time. Mount St. Helens is the first lateral blast eruption ever witnessed in the world, which actually transformed volcanology itself during this time, which is amazing. This debris flow, or shearing off of the side of Mount St. Helens, is actually the largest landslide ever in historic time. It was 2.5 cubic kilometers of material. When this material is taken off of the volcano, all of the pressure on the magma chamber is then released, which is going to release as erupted material in a magmatic eruption, or in this case, what is known as a Plinian eruption. The lateral blast traveled about 480 kilometers per hour over 30 kilometers. There were a bunch of ice and snow on the top of Mount St. Helens, all of the glaciers. As soon as the volcano erupts, those glaciers then melt into what is known as lahars, which are just volcanic mud flows. You can think of it as like cement moving very quickly down the river valleys, basically destroying anything in its path. They traveled about 36 meters per second to about 7 to 12 meters per second as they got down off of the volcanic slope, over about 220 kilometers through the river channels that surrounded Mount St. Helens. The pyroclastic flows, which are superheated ash and rock debris, that basically if you're trapped in one, you will be suffocated and burned to death. This is what killed the people of Pompeii. These pyroclastic flows also occurred, and they travel also very quickly, about 80 to 130 kilometers per hour, and they traveled a distance about 8 kilometers. The vertical column, which is the ash that is being pushed up, the Plinian style of eruption being pushed up to the atmosphere, reached about 24 kilometers. The eruption and lateral blast of Mount St. Helens took off the upper 300 meters, which is about 1,000 feet off of the volcanic cone itself. And the lateral blast, since again it traveled so fast over such a great distance, blasted all of the forest surrounding the north side of Mount St. Helens and flattened it. And that's what this image is showing right here. This just goes on and on and on. If you visit Mount St. Helens today, all of the trees are still knocked over. You can still see all of the logs, and you can see how far you are from Mount St. Helens. It's a pretty eerie sight to behold, but I do recommend all of you to visit Mount St. Helens if you ever have the chance. Once this volcano erupted, within seconds to minutes. Pretty much everything in the exclusion zone was covered in volcanic debris. Coldwater 1 and Coldwater 2 were destroyed. Coldwater 2 was blasted by the lateral blast, killing Dave Johnson. Mount St. Helens erupted for 9 hours. Within that 9 hours, it killed 57 people. Still a tragedy to lose 57 lives, but if this volcano was not being monitored or was closer to a populous area, the death toll could be much, much higher. The volcanic eruption phase itself, since it started erupting in the morning, it peaked around 3 to 5 p.m. On May 18th, and then after 5 p.m., it started to die down. This eruption style, again, a lateral blast was never seen, but the eruption style known as a Plinian eruption is what Mount St. Helens did. A Plinian eruption is actually named after Plinian. Plinian survived the Mount Vesuvius eruption in Pompeii, but he's credited for the documentation of Mount Vesuvius erupting in a scientific manner that then kind of was the birth of volcanology, if you want to think of it like that, or the study of volcanoes. And so this style of eruption that Mount St. Helens had and Mount Vesuvius had is known as a Plinian eruption. We also have other eruption styles like subplinian and ultraplinian, so just denoting the size of material erupted. In the case of the scale we use to measure volcanoes, Mount St. Helens eruption was about a magnitude 5 on the VEI scale. VEI just stands for Volcano Explosivity Index, or Volcanic Explosivity Index, which is just a rating. Technically, the VEI scale only goes up to 8 because that is as much volcanic material that we've documented, which is denoted to one of Yellowstone's eruptions, which we consider a super eruption, a massive eruption on a global scale, if you want to think of it like that. So VEI 5 is still large, but not the largest that could exist on this planet. You can see in the image that this woman is holding up, this is what Mount St. Helens looked like before the eruption, as I showed earlier, and this is it after the eruption. This is actually even a later, closer to current time photo, because you can actually see the 2004 to 2008 lava dome that has grown inside of the crater of Mount St. Helens. This is a satellite image of Mount St. Helens soon after the eruption. You can see it's all gray. It's all gray. It's not a black and white image or anything, like this is green for forest. You're actually just seeing all of the volcanic dust and ash of powderized rock that is spread over. This is the lateral blast direction going northward. This is Spirit Lake where Harry Truman was. You can see Spirit Lake was covered in ash and logs, which these logs are still floating there to this day. I mentioned Harry Truman. Harry Truman did refuse to evacuate. He was one of the 57 that died. That was his choice and his right. What I'm only angry about is that he had 16 cats, and the 16 cats didn't evacuate, so all 16 cats are also buried with him. Harry Truman and Dave Johnson, who both died in the lateral blast, are covered under about 100 feet of volcanic material, so their bodies have never been recovered. But Dave Johnson does have the visitor center at Mount St. Helens named after him, so you can go and see. That's actually where this image up here is taken. It's from the Dave Johnson Visitor Center, which has a beautiful overlook at Mount St. Helens. If you do ever want to visit Mount St. Helens, which again, I totally recommend because it's so cool, I recommend going in spring. It's beautiful. It's covered in wildflowers, which also has a beautiful juxtaposition to all of the destruction of ash. The Lahar deposits and a few of the ash deposits are still seen today, and so you can still see those scars on the landscape. Then nearby or between those deposits, you have all of these beautiful wildflowers. So it's a pretty interesting juxtaposition of a very traumatic eruption that basically triggered a whole new study of volcanoes, because we now know a volcanic lateral blast is possible, which made us relook at other volcanoes within the Cascades and around the world, such as Mount Shasta in Northern California. We had seen all of these weird deposits along Mount Shasta that we didn't exactly know how they were formed, but after Mount St. Helens, we knew exactly that is how Mount Shasta's basically weird volcanic structures formed. It was from a lateral blast. So we now know other volcanoes within the Cascades can have lateral blast. As well, the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption had similar signs to the Mount St. Helens eruption. Mount Pinatubo was much larger. Its eruption actually lowered the global temperature by 1 degree Celsius for a whole year. So this is a much larger scale eruption, but that eruption was fully predicted within 3 days, and the whole entire island in the Philippines, which Philippines has a bunch of islands, but the island that Mount Pinatubo was on was fully evacuated, at least the people that wanted to evacuate. And then within 3 days of the evacuations, the main phase eruption of Mount Pinatubo occurred, and this is due to a lot of the information that had been gathered from the Mount St. Helens eruption. So even though Mount St. Helens did take 57 lives, the science from it was then able to save hundreds of thousands of lives in the future due to the volcanic study and the volcanic programs that were birthed out of the Mount St. Helens eruption. So that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed learning about volcanoes and Mount St. Helens. The main thing I want you to take away from this is that a lot of people think volcanoes just wake up and boom, erupt. So a lot of people are scared of Yellowstone or whatever volcano that they live near just because they think one day it's just going to have a Pompeii and kill everyone. Pompeii, Mount St. Helens, Yellowstone, all of these volcanoes always have waking up signs. Volcanoes don't just wake up. There's always signs of magma movement. All of the active volcanoes, aka volcanoes that erupted in the past 2,000 years, at least in the United States, are all heavily monitored. So if the volcanoes do show signs of waking up, exclusion zones, just like Mount St. Helens, will be formed. In this case, since we didn't know Mount St. Helens or any volcano could have a lateral blast, all of the volcanic hazard maps were incredibly wrong, and the exclusion zone should have been much larger, but that was due to lack of knowledge that we now have. There is a really good documentary that I'm also blanking on the name of. I'll put it in the text though below. It's on YouTube. It's free. I think it's like 50 minutes or an hour. It's really good, but it shows you basically all the video images and firsthand accounts of Mount St. Helens survivors and geologists involved. So I really recommend that if you are interested in volcanology or geology or just the history of Mount St. Helens. But with that, please like and subscribe. Please watch me live on Twitch at Gobbimaru. And I hope you guys all enjoy a good day. Bye!